Thank you very much. Well, we now have about half an hour, 25 minutes for questions. So I throw the floor open. Please. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a specific question, but I wonder if you could give me a generalised answer. And it's this. I've recently been working in Myanmar trying to persuade the government there to sign up to international human rights treaties. So am I wasting my time? I mean that in the sense that is it a waste of time to ask any country to sign up to international human rights treaties?
No, I mean the question, I don't think it's a waste of, first of all, why do human rights, why is it in a country's interest to sign up for, not so much to sign up for the treaties, but to treat its people in a way that's consistent with what we all understand to be human rights? Yeah, I guess there's a narrow reason to avoid sanctions from some and the rest, but the real reason is that it's in their own self-interest, that societies that tend to be more open and free and respectful of the differences of their citizens tend to be more successful and productive. Essentially, top-heavy societies that don't particularly respect human rights or certain types of, whether it's lifestyle or religious or what have you, rights, often want the benefits of openness without the reality of it. And in my experience, easier said than done. And I think it's actually a country like China is going to have to deal with that at some point. China's growth is slowing for many reasons, but one of the reasons is it's not as innovative as it needs to be. And you can't control intellectual life on campuses and then hope those same campuses become fountains of innovation. It doesn't work that way. So I think for the Myanmars and others on a much smaller scale, they're going to have to decide not simply how to conduct themselves so they avoid sanctions and the like from countries such as the United States or the EU, which for whom this is an important consideration, but just simply they're going to have to decide what kind of a society they want, and because there will be consequences in terms not just of the quality of life, but the level of wealth and standard of living if they continue to keep a lid on. So no, I don't think you're wasting your time. I think at the end of the day, though, what's more important than outsiders preaching these things are insiders preaching these things. So often the best thing outsiders can do is empower insiders. And I always say, how do we get civil society going in these countries? Because, I don't necessarily expect them to become democracies overnight. And in many cases, a rush to democracy can be an error because you don't have the checks and balances in place. So what you really want to do is seed civil society. You want to see independent institutions develop. You want to see people get well educated. You want to make sure girls get educational opportunities and things like that. So if you take a longer look, so I don't think you're wasting your time, but it may not be the answer is to get them to sign on the dotted line today. It may be to think about those behaviors or trends you encourage that over the next generation could make a real difference.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you for a very stimulating tour d'horizon. It seemed to me that a thread running through it, which you didn't speak about explicitly, was the ability, the capacity to manage change in an orderly way. If that's a major criterion for judging whether we've got order or not, then maybe the glass is a bit more full than you gave it credit for.
Oh, good.
I mean, one could say that we managed 1989 to 91 was one of the great historical sets of events, and yet it was managed in a perhaps more my luck than judgment, but there was a lot of judgment as well, in a pretty amazingly orderly way. Even the non-proliferation regime, which you were quite sceptical about, one could turn it upside down and say, following especially the ideas of Ken Waltz and John Mearsheimer, that there could have been an awful lot more countries which would have gone down that path. So even though the regime is theoretically or normatively not very satisfactory, nonetheless we've limited it to 9 over now 70 years. So that the last thing I would say is that therefore the challenge today, especially for the United States, is how we can manage the rise of China, for example. If the Soviet Union's disappeared, actually we gave Russia a Soviet Union seat on the Security Council, so that was a very practical example of managing change. Maybe that was a mistake, but anyway, we did it. But how do we, and particularly the United States as the leader, as you pointed out, manage the orderly rise of China without seeing it as a threat.
Okay, so here I'm in the same position I was in yesterday. That's the subject of tomorrow. But let me just sort of say a couple things, and I'll talk to it a little bit. One is, you're right, 1989, 91. So many people said it was inevitable. Well, I was at the White House at the time. It didn't look so inevitable from there. The idea, or imagine you had been a historian at any time before and said, let me see if I got this right. We're going to have the peaceful end of the Cold War in a decade. We're going to have the peaceful breakup of what was the Soviet Union. Several of the component pieces are going to give up their nuclear weapons, so there won't be a command and control problem. Oh, and by the way, we're going to have the peaceful unification of Germany, all within NATO. And I always said, yeah, right. That's the difference between wishery and strategy. But it happened. And you had some remarkable people there on all sides. I mean, from Gorbachev and people like that on his side to President Bush 41 and some of the people around him, Brent Scowcroft, Jim Baker, and others. And it was extraordinarily deftly handled. But that was pretty close in some ways to a bilateral negotiation. The European role was limited, and in many cases, the European powers were quite skeptical of what we were doing. I mean, you know this well. And the United States was at something of the apogee of its position, so it could listen to and then ignore some of the objections of its allies, who were extremely uncomfortable with what was being done vis-a-vis Germany. And we just did it, to put it bluntly. And the protests of the British and the French was, thank you very much, and now we're going to do this, get on board. But that, again, I'm not sure that kind of a problem is emblematic of the sorts of challenges we're up against. But I agree, it was definitely handled. The non-proliferation regime, you're right. When John F. Kennedy gave the famous speech at American University in the early 60s, he predicted dozens of nuclear weapon states by now. Thank God that prediction was wrong. But just because we've gotten to where we are you going to tell me the next 70 years are going to go as well as the past 70? I don't feel it. And what worries me, I never know what the phrase inflection point means, but I think we're at one. And with what's going on with Iran and all that. And also there's a difference between certain countries, like in North Korea, having one or two old nukes. But at the rate North Korea is going, it's quite possible that, say, by the end of this decade or early next one, which is saying by probably in the first term of the next American president, the head of American intelligence is going to stroll into the Oval Office and say, North Korea not only now has enough nuclear material through its various programs to have, say, 30, 40 nuclear weapons, but by the way, we now believe they can produce miniature warheads that they can put on long-range missiles that can reach the continental United States. That's a qualitatively different kind of challenge. So yeah, we've done okay on the non-proliferation front. I just don't feel that past is necessarily prologue. And I agree, the rise of China is fundamental. We'll talk about it tomorrow. I'll simply say, depending upon how the management of China's rise goes, I actually think not just the region, but the world's a very different place. A big chunk of 21st century history is going to be determined on China's rise. Partially, it's going to be an external challenge for the United States, Japan, and Korea, and others. Partially, it's going to be a China challenge, because I think there's still fundamental questions out there about China's trajectory internally, about the character of China. I don't think that is for a second been settled. If anything, I think a lot of what we're seeing going on in China is testimony to the fact that China's character hasn't been settled. And a lot of what Xi Jinping is doing is trying to encourage certain things and discourage others. As you might expect, there's pushback. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a smooth sail from here to there. So I'd say stay tuned. I don't mean in terms of me, but in terms of China. So I think it's partially, yes, the question of managing China's rise. But I actually think a lot is beyond. It's the difference, it's the limits to our influence. I think the Chinese are going to have to make some extraordinarily consequential decisions about the character of contemporary China.
John Dunn.
A couple of questions, really. The first thing is in response to what you just said, which is, do you actually think the character of what's going to happen is settled anywhere. I mean, what's the contrast case to you? But the one which I hope in a way links what you were talking about at the end yesterday with what you're going to be talking about tomorrow. You were talking at the end yesterday about how to do diplomacy, how to do statecraft. And you said very cogently that it's very important not to be over-ambitious. You instanced the case of Libya, which is a compelling example of that. But presumably it's also very important not to be under-ambitious.
Sure.
And one might instance perhaps the case of Syria as an example,
Sure.
a plausible example,
Yeah.
where it would have been very difficult to have done worse than we seem to have done, not done. So the question I wanted to press on you is, do you think there's any ex-ante criteria of any reliability for what it is to be over-ambitious
Sure.
or under-ambitious?
Yeah. Look, character's settled. Look, settled for how long? You know, for all time, no. But I was wrong. I actually thought that a lot of Europe's character was pretty settled. And if you had asked me 5 years ago, you know, I actually made the decision, I'll talk about, you know, that not to place as many resources at my institution working on Europe, but instead to put them more in Asia, the Middle East, because I was much more conscious that that's where I thought history was going to be happening. I didn't foresee what happened with Russia and Ukraine 5 years ago, and some of the growth of right-wing parties and some of the other things that's happening, you know, or in some cases left-wing parties in Europe. I just didn't see. So yes, you're right, nothing's ever settled. But some things are more unsettled than others. Or they look relative. I mean, I'm not worried, for example, about massive outbreaks of conflict in Latin America. I'm not. I'm not, you know, I'm a little bit more worried about parts of Europe. I think you heard what I said about Asia, Africa, the problems are localized. North America's pretty settled, by the way. We're feeling pretty good about it. And indeed, one of the great success stories of the last few years has been Mexico, which is, I think, an underappreciated success. And the Middle East, I'm pretty confident, will be unsettled. What's settled about the Middle East is that it will not be settled, and that it's not on the edge of anything positive. Look, you're exactly right. When I mentioned before, the Middle East is the way it is for 3 reasons. Local realities, the certain issues dealing with Middle Eastern societies. Second of all is acts of omission and acts of commission. And commission might be the 2003 Iraq War, the invasion of Libya. Acts of omission would be the lack of follow-up in Libya after the invasion, or what we didn't do in Syria at various times. So I actually think you're right. It's actually one of the understudied issues in the field is inaction. And what I used to tell my students and people who work for me was when you do the options memo, do X, do Y, do Z, make sure that the option of doing nothing gets just as much attention. It's every bit as much of an option as doing this or that. And by and large, bureaucracies aren't as good at assessing the ups and downs, the pros and cons of doing nothing. We could talk about it. I've got lots of views about how to judge interventions in advance, and you're right, because there's a kind of a Goldilocks. What's enough but not too much, and how do you avoid mistakes? But I would simply say the beginning is understand local realities. And we're having a test case. We're sitting here, the situation in Yemen. I'll take a minute on it. So the question is, you've got this situation now unfolding. What's too much? What's too little? So the Saudis have decided that they had to do air attacks. United States has decided it's got to lend diplomatic support to what the Saudis are doing and sending a carrier battle group in the neighborhood. But the United States has been facilitating certain things the Saudis and the UAE are doing, but it's not been going beyond a certain point. And my reaction to it all is, well, what's your definition of success here? And what's your sense of achievable success? Because given the nature of Yemen, I mean, in my last book I wrote, one of the first rules about invading countries is you should understand them. It's a prerequisite to invasion. And as stupid as it sounds, we often ignore it. I don't think the United States really understood important aspects of Vietnamese society before it found itself incredibly involved in Vietnam. We certainly didn't with Iraq. And all these people who were predicting what would be the aftermath of ousting Saddam Hussein, and you remember the silly things about the kids were going to be throwing candy. Well, they were throwing things at us, it just wasn't candy. It was IEDs and rocks and stuff like that. So in the case of Yemen, you've really got to ask yourself, given the nature of the composition of that society and the cleavages in that society, is that a place to draw lines and get very ambitious? I would say no. So I actually think in Yemen, probably the dangers of being over-ambitious are greater than the dangers of being under-ambitious. So I would say, if I were advising the Saudis and others, I would have said, largely guard yourself against certain bad things stemming from Yemen, flow of terrorists, large flows of refugees, rather than trying to get in the middle of Yemen, which I don't think is a wise idea.
I'd like to take a question from a student now. Is that, yes?
Understanding the ambiguities around the word justice, to what extent can justice continue to be a part of our order?
It's a great question. The answer it is, but justice is often in the eyes of the beholder. And it's not the only consideration. So people have other considerations. I mean, to take an example, if you look at Ukraine, and we might say, well, what Russia's doing is obviously unjust, and I would say it is, and therefore certain things should flow from it. But I expect if Mr. Putin were up here today answering this question, he would say what was unjust was everything from the way Russian ethnics were treated to larger developments in Europe over the last 25 years, and this was the right thing to do. This was, if you will, he was doing this in the name of justice as he sees it. So it's a fairly malleable concept. I think the word to me, justice, has more than a legal content. It's also got something of a moral content. You've got concepts of justice in the rules of law. When you go to war, what's a just war? The use of force, self-defense, yes, widespread acceptance. So I think that has tremendous consequences in terms of general sympathy for those who are invaded and general antipathy for those who are doing the invading. Tremendous sense of, that it's unjust to say to do things that cause civilian casualties. And I think that explains some of the changed ethos against terrorism, why there's less tolerance in the world now towards terrorism. It wasn't enough to get people to react as they might have towards Bashar al-Assad for his use of chemicals or more recently barrel bombs. But I think it's out there. I think it's just the problem with is there's no consensus on it, and it's competing with other concerns. So a lot of people, even if they agreed on justice and what it constituted, they might say, but in this case we don't have the luxury. We got 6 other things we got to worry about more. Or they might say there's time for that later. First we got to get stuff done. Often justice is the caboose. The whole concept of war crimes is, if you will, justice at the end of the process. Or in many cases we just don't agree on what constitutes it. So, when most of the people have written, from Hedley Bull to Kissinger and others, who I quoted a lot yesterday, about order, they make it pretty clear that they're not talking about justice. What they're talking about are preconditions that would encourage certain types of behaviors between states, and it may have nothing to do with justice. It might mean, in some ways, not using force to remedy an unjust situation, be it between the states or within their borders, but they would simply say the priority needs to be given to peaceful relations rather than justice. Because if it became a world in which justice or injustice was always to be remedied, and injustice was in the eyes of the beholder, then you're in a pre-Westphalian world. And I think, by the way, it's what I said yesterday, I hadn't thought about to your question, but that's one of the problems with, for all the imperfections of a limited notion of order, a very expansive notion of order, which would have you acting all the time in the name of perceived injustice, could become a very disorderly world. But now you've made me think about it more. I like that.
Thank you very much. So I'll take the last few questions together, and then I'll
Okay, I'll
ask
try to
you.
give shorter answers.
First of all, you, sir, and then the lady. Yes.
Let me ask a question relating, relating the analogy from the yesterday's lecture. Yesterday you said one of the greatest achievements of the Cold War area was prevention of Cold War becoming hot war. And I can see the analogy for this century in the economic sphere of preventing Great Recession turning prevented Great Recession turning into Great Depression after the global financial crisis. And for that particular crisis in the beginning of this century, we basically tried different methodology or economic policy responses from the previous ones, like not only in the 1930s crisis, that was basically protectionism, but also compared with things like Asian currency crisis, whereby we basically used contractory market economic policy rather than expansionary one. So this was really a sort of new initiative, as a response, as a global or international coordinated response to the crisis. And I just wanted to know your assessment of our response to this particular crisis, and if there's anywhere where we could have been done better.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
My question was very much on the same lines, which is the balance between economic causalities and political situation. Because for each of the crises you mentioned, as an economist, I could give you an economic story which explains quite a lot. Not everything, but would give you quite a lot of explanation. So it's the balance between the two.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions. Gentleman here and the gentleman at the back. And if you could be as brief as possible, please, so that Dr. Haass can answer as fully as possible.
Sure.
Yes.
I want to ask about the Saudi intervention in Yemen and its relation to the world order. The Saudi intervention seems to be a culmination of fatigue from U.S. retreat. Both the mission and commission, starting with Iraq War 2003 and the non-action in Syria, all running against perceived Arab interest in the region. I was wondering if you assessed the Saudi intervention as a symptom of lack of world order because of the U.S. retreat, or possibly as a diffusion of orders, as you mentioned, that might complement the fact that, as you said, there is no international community and there's a need for regional order to be imposed or implemented by people from within the region.
Thank you. Last question.
Yes. How would you evaluate the diplomatic interaction between President Obama and Vladimir Putin regarding Ukraine over the past several months and the reaction by the Russian people?
Okay, thank you all. How did the world do after 2008? Not bad. Not bad. Let me put it this way. The world didn't go into depression. And the reasons that certain countries or parts of the world did not do better was less to do with international responses than with local responses or the lack of them. And so I actually think that the world effort to, for example, set new, I talked about Basel III and regulatory standards for financial institutions, give them larger financial cushions to weather crises, but not so large that it became deflation or anti-growth. Not bad, not bad. We didn't have a major round of protectionism. Again, the dog that didn't bark in the night, that somehow we managed to go through times, those rough times, without having massive trade and currency wars. The world, tolerated the United States, didn't like it, but tolerated American quantitative easing, which, by the way, the world now, after complaining about it, is glad we did it, because now we're in a position to be something of an engine for the rest of the world to export to. We'll see now if we're, how much we just complain about when others do the same thing in Europe and Japan. No, it shows to me still a lack of certain types of machinery, and I think one of the real questions we've got to, we still don't, I mentioned the problems with trade, the WTO is moribund, the IMF problems, and I think also there is this tension between domestic economic reactions to low growth And when we did it, we didn't think enough about the international consequences. And the United States, if we're going to run the world's reserve currency, I believe it's incumbent upon us to give the rest of the world a little bit more of a voice in what we do. We can't have it both ways. We can't run it as simply a domestic currency at the same time it's the world's reserve currency, and I think there's a tension there. But all in all, not bad. I don't know, it's just like Harvard, everybody gets an A. At Cambridge, you'd give the world, if not an A, you'd probably give it a B plus or something, which at Harvard's like failure, but but maybe here you're more intellectually honest. I don't know. In terms of, I think there's contributing economics to just about everything. If you look at the Balkans, say, and you look at the work of Susan Woodward and others, and you look at what was going on there beforehand, obviously that mattered. You look now at the Middle East. Some of the reasons that, to continue the metaphor, there's so much kindling on the fire is in part because of everything from countries with resource curses to countries like Yemen, which are the poorest in the region, to the corruption, you name it. So you're right. And I think it's one of the reasons, one of my, the line people who work with me, one of the many lines I use that they're tired of hearing is, well, this probably won't go down well here. We'll try it anyhow. Universities have departments, but the world doesn't. And so universities may silo things with economics or politics or what have you, but you're right. You've got to factor it. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, we've got to increasingly train people who are not just one discipline people, because the world doesn't work that way. Though it's a problem. I mean, I mentioned before with cyber. There's almost no person on the planet who has the requisite skill set to write intelligent things about how to deal with the cyber challenge. By the time you know enough about the technology, you don't have time to know about the other stuff. So you really have to bring people together with different backgrounds. And one of the problems, at least in our country, I don't know about here, is too many of the political scientists don't know about economics and too many of the economists don't know about political science. It's a real problem. I think the question about Saudi Arabia and Yemen is interesting. I think the answer is yes to everything you said. Yes, it's in part a frustration with the United States, what we particularly didn't do in Syria, and a loss of confidence in the US and this administration. And it's a real sign of what I would call the decentralization of decision making. So it's not just that the Saudis have capacity, they've had capacity for years. But what we're seeing is a region or a world where people are deferring less to the United States and they're taking matters into their own hands. Now, is that good? Depends. What kind of judgment will they show? What happens when they get into trouble? All things being equal, I'm not wild about it. I think this is a world that's going to be much more difficult to organize. And the chance for many more localized conflicts, I think, will grow. And the problem is that, again, what may begin local has regional consequences. So if there's a problem with Saudi Arabia does things in Yemen and Iran. Like, I don't think Iran was the principal driver of events in Yemen. I think the Saudis probably exaggerated the Iranian hand initially. And not to say the Iranians were 100% hands off, but I don't think Iran was the principal driver. I think it was much more internal to Yemen. Saudi action now will probably increase the Iranian dimension. It'll bring about exactly what the Saudis didn't want to see to some extent. And this has the potential to grow. That ain't good for the region, ain't good for Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia has its hands full, among other things, with dealing with the Islamic State. If I were a country that oversaw the cities of Mecca and Medina, I would be very concerned that a group, ISIS or ISIL, that calls itself the Islamic State, is going to set its ambitions on it. So if I were Saudi Arabia, I'd be very mindful of the threat it could face, either from ISIS or from insiders who would sympathize with it. So I'm not sure it's in Saudi Arabia's interest to get involved in a major struggle in Yemen right now. Anyhow, but this is reality. The United States can't stop it. One of the consequences, coming back to Professor Dunn's question, of American inaction at certain times, is we have encouraged a world of greater independent action. I don't think that's a great idea. I think when we raise questions about American reliability and willingness to act, I think we're setting in motion some worrisome trends, whether it's in the Middle East or Asia, friends and foe alike. I mean, if you get a situation in Asia where, say, the Japans and others no longer have the confidence in American reliability, that has real consequences. So it's something that I think this administration, whenever you compartmentalize decision-making and you see, to use the same, very little takes place. It may seem to be taking place on one square of the chessboard, but it has consequences for just about the entire board. And what we didn't do in Syria, for example, when we made the comments about Assad not using chemicals, if you use chemicals, serious consequences. When you use chemicals and there were not serious consequences, I think that had real implications, not just for the region and not just for Syria, but for the world. And I think it was high up there on consequential, it was a highly consequential inaction, if you will. In terms of the Obama-Putin question, look, I make a general point, because I'm not privy to the details of their personal conversations. It would just seem that whatever the conversations have been, they have not persuaded Mr. Putin to act with great restraint. In my experience, too many people put too much emphasis on personal relationships in diplomacy. By and large, I haven't known that governments behave differently, particularly because they like you. They calculate their self-interests and all that. Now, whether they trust you or believe you is a different thing. But the idea that too many leaders, and this has happened for decades and decades, not just in my country, seem to think that personal chemistry, and they've really broken through, and Stalin really understands me, or this guy really, it doesn't work that way in my experience. So I think Putin's basically improvised. I don't think he had all these plans, but I think he was enjoying the Olympics, and suddenly Yanukovych got chased out of the presidential palace in downtown Kiev, and Putin said, this is not a precedent I can allow to stand, I have to act. And one thing led to another, and we are where we are. And it wasn't about anything with his relationship with Obama. I think he basically calculated that he needed to do it, and he could probably get away with it. And Russian people seem to like it because his popularity ratings are sky high. Now, at some point, his popularity ratings will fall down to earth because of the cumulative effect, I think, of the economic problems. Just yesterday and today, there are articles in the papers about Russians going on strike because of not getting paid and so forth. So Putin has to tend to the home front. And the real question is, will he continue to be nationalist as a way to compensate and distract, or at some point does he rein in the nationalism abroad in order to turn to the home front? Because at the end of the day, what he really wants to do is preserve his hold on power. I'm still hopeful that he parks some of his external ambitions in order to turn to the home front and maybe get sanctions eased and all that. But I wouldn't bet the farm on it. I don't know. And what's scary about Russia, we can end with this, is at the height of the Cold War, say the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was far more bureaucratic and organizational constraint on Soviet leadership than there is on Russian leadership now. Mr. Putin's a one-man band. There's no supreme Soviet, if you will, reining him in. So Khrushchev and then later Brezhnev, Kosygin, the others, they were constrained to a large degree by the Politburo. Mr. Putin is much less constrained organizationally. That worries me. So it's very hard to make predictions about political systems that are that top-heavy, and that might apply to right now to him or to North Korea, to some extent to a Turkey, where you have one person who is so primus inter pares. And so that's why it's hard for me to stand down here and say with any degree of confidence what he's going to do or not do, because he is as unconstrained, certainly as any leader of his country since Stalin. And that gives me pause.
Thank you. Well, that seems a suitably resonant and tantalizing note on which to end. As you can see, your lectures provoked a very lively discussion. It could have gone on a great deal longer. We must finish now, but not before doing three things. First of all, to congratulate the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and CRASSH for putting on this splendid series. You said that universities have departments, which we do, but we also have CRASSH, which knits them all together and has created this remarkable hub. Secondly, to note that we heard yesterday about the past of world order. Today, it's somewhat problematic present, and I hope you've all had your appetites whetted, not so much for the future, but for the advertised prospects, the solutions, if you like, which you will get tomorrow, same time, same place. And finally, of course, we must and we want to thank you very much for an excellent lecture.
Thank you.